He went out to sea after the storm, just to retrieve his fishing nets. But instead, he found a mysterious island that appears on no map. An old lighthouse beckoned with a faint flicker of light, as if calling for help. What the man discovered inside was never meant to be seen by the world. Subscribe and comment. Which city would you dare to sail to after this? Artem had always told himself that life on the coast was supposed to be simple. Wake up before dawn, drink burnt coffee from a chipped mug, walk down to the boat anchored on the rocky shore, and set out into the gray morning. The sea gave what it wanted and took what it pleased. A man learned not to argue with it. But somewhere along the way, routine had stopped being comforting and had turned into a slow suffocation. Each day looked the same as the one before it, and Artem felt as if he were dissolving into that sameness. His house stood on the edge of a small fishing settlement, a handful of weathered roofs crouched against the cold winds. People minded their own business. They talked about fish quotas, storms, and bad luck. Mostly bad luck these days. Artem's luck had run thin long ago. His wife had died before she reached 40. His daughter, now grown, had moved away and rarely called. The silence in his home was persistent and heavy, like the fog that often clung to the shore. Still, he kept working. What else was there to do? When the storm hit the previous night, it came suddenly, tearing through the bay like a beast that had been pacing outside for too long. Waves crushed against the breakwater, and the wind howled in the pipes like a mourning voice. Artem had spent the night pacing inside his home, listening to the storm batter his world, helpless to stop the damage he knew was coming. By morning, the winds had eased but left behind chaos. His fishing nets, his only investment for the season, had been torn loose somewhere in the dark. Losing them would mean more debt with the suppliers, more tension with the harbor inspector, and another reason to feel like a failure. The storm had stolen enough from him already. He wasn't going to let it take this too. He made his way to the pier, ignoring the remarks tossed his way by the other fishermen. They told him the sea was still restless and that only fools went out so soon after a storm. He didn't answer. It wasn't bravery pushing him forward, but desperation. He knew exactly how much he owed. He knew how little patience the world had left for him. Debt collectors didn't forgive. The sea didn't either. His boat wasn't much to look at, just a battered vessel with peeling paint and an engine that coughed every time it started. But it was all he had. He ran his hand along the railing, feeling the cold steel and rough patches he'd welded himself. The sky was a dull, threatening gray. Damp wind whipped at his jacket as he loaded his supplies. A thermos, his radio, a small toolbox, a flashlight, a coil of rope. He checked the fuel. It was barely enough, but it would have to do. He started the engine, and the familiar sputtering came before the hum he needed. The sound gave him a fragile reassurance. At least one thing still worked. He set off quietly, slipping past the protective arm of the breakwater and into open water. The sea was swollen from the storm, its surface uneven, angry in ways difficult to predict. Artem held the wheel tightly, steering carefully as the boat rose and fell over restless swells. He scanned the surface for any sign of his nets, for anything bright enough to stand out against the steely water. For a while there was nothing but silence and the low groaning of the engine. Then he began to find the wreckage of other men's work-broken buoys, cracked wooden crates, and shredded pieces of netting, sad evidence of what the storm had swallowed. His nets could be anywhere. Rain began as an icy mist, then sharpened into slanted needles that blurred the horizon. Artem cursed under his breath and wiped his brow, tasting salt and cold air. He tried calling the harbor on the radio, hoping someone might have reported stray equipment. The only response was the crackle of static. The storm had damaged the radio towers again, likely leaving him on his own until repairs could be made. As he moved farther from shore, visibility worsened. The water took on the color of slate, and the wind sharpened into shrill gusts that jerked at his coat. The waves felt heavier, as if something beneath the surface stirred them. He had just spotted what looked like a piece of his missing gear when he noticed something else, something larger. Through the curtains of rain appeared a dark shape, a jagged silhouette interrupting the flat horizon. He first thought it a trick of the weather, but as he drew closer, the form sharpened into something unmistakably real, the rise of land. He slowed the engine, staring in disbelief. He had sailed these waters since he was a boy. There was no island here, at least none marked on any map he'd ever seen. The rain briefly thinned as a gust cleared the air around him, revealing the structure that stood atop the rocky rise. A lighthouse, tall and narrow, its once white walls stained by time and storms. Its lantern wasn't bright, just a faint, flickering pulse that barely cut through the gloom. But the light was on. Someone had to keep it lit. Yet he couldn't imagine who. There had been no talk of restoration, no funding, no keepers assigned in decades. If a lighthouse still burned here, something was wrong. Artem gripped the wheel tightly, torn between instinct and reason. The sea didn't care for curiosity. It punished those who chased mysteries. But the waves had grown hungrier, reaching higher against the hull. The engine coughed warningly as wind and water battered the boat. He had no choice. Shelter was the only sensible option. As he neared the island, the sea broke violently against the sharp, dark rocks. He maneuvered carefully, searching for a safer pocket of shoreline. But the storm had left little room for decisions. A surge of water lifted the boat and slammed it toward the stones. He braced himself, knuckles white, as the vessel scraped, lurched, and finally wedged into a narrow opening between two jagged outcroppings. The engine sputtered once more and died. Artem attempted to restart it, but only silence followed. The boat listed awkwardly, taking on small amounts of water. His breath came out in a sharp exhale of frustration and exhaustion. There would be no leaving until he fixed the engine, and fixing it would be impossible in this weather. He grabbed his supplies, radio, thermos, tools, and climbed carefully onto the slick rocks. Each step was treacherous, the stones slick with algae and rain. The icy spray soaked through his clothes, chilling him to the bone. Ahead of him, a narrow trail of eroded steps wound its way up the slope toward the lighthouse. The island was small, barely more than a rugged mound of stone and stunted vegetation struggling to survive in salt and wind. The lighthouse, the only visible structure, rose like a sentinel over the sea, solemn and foreboding. Artem felt a pulse of unease. Something about the place felt wrong, like stepping into an untouched graveyard where silence held every secret tight. But he forced his legs to move. Storms did not show mercy. Whatever waited behind the heavy lighthouse door would be better than freezing to death on open rock. As he climbed, his boots slipped more than once, and the wind tore at him with fierce determination. He paused halfway up, panting lightly, looking back at the water churning below. His boat looked even smaller against the wild ocean backdrop, dwarfed by the power of nature. He swallowed a lump in his throat and turned back toward the tower. The lighthouse loomed larger with each step. Its metal door was battered and streaked with rust, its hinges thick with years of neglect. Faint paint flakes clung desperately to the structure, remnants of its former role as a guardian of sailors. A faded metal plaque, barely legible, hung crooked near the entrance. The letters were scraped by time, leaving only a few twisted symbols that told nothing helpful. Artem adjusted the strap of his tool bag over his shoulder, steadied his breathing, and placed his hand on the cold handle of the lighthouse door. He hesitated only a second longer, just enough to admit the fear he felt deep inside. Then he pushed. The door groaned loudly, metal protesting the disturbance. A gust of stale, sour air spilled out, carrying the scent of abandonment and something else, something too faint to define, but disturbing enough to raise the hairs along his neck. He stepped inside. The storm roared just beyond the thick walls, but here the sound faded into a muffled rumble. Artem stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the heavy air, revealing unexpected shapes and shadows that didn't belong in a normal lighthouse. Thoughts flickered through his mind. Memories of old fishermen stories about military secrets, forbidden islands, classified facilities hidden from maps. He had always laughed those off. Now he wasn't sure. Whatever this place was, it didn't feel like it existed for guiding ships. It felt like a place meant to keep something or someone hidden. The realization seemed to echo inside him as loudly as the storm outside. He exhaled, a slow and uneasy breath, as the door creaked shut behind him with a metallic thud that sounded far too final. He had found shelter, but deep inside, Artem already sensed the truth. He had just stepped into something far worse than the storm. The heavy door settled shut behind Artem with a metallic echo that rippled through the hollow interior of the tower. The sound carried too far, as if the walls themselves were long unused to any disturbance. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly in his grip, though he told himself it was because of the cold. The air inside felt stale, thick with the scent of dust, rust, and something more unsettling, like old medicine, decayed and forgotten. He expected the usual layout of a lighthouse. A narrow room with some equipment, perhaps a spiral staircase leading upward. Instead, his light revealed a corridor stretching deeper into the structure, far more than the base of a lighthouse should allow. Thick doors lined the walls of the hallway, each outfitted with heavy hinges and industrial locks. They were far too reinforced for any ordinary maintenance room. For a moment, Artem simply stood there, stunned by the sight. A lighthouse was supposed to guide sailors to safety, not imprison them. He took a cautious step forward, the soles of his boots scraping against the gritty floor. Dust puffed upward at every movement. Yet here and there he noticed markings in the dirt that did not belong to long-abandoned spaces. Faint streaks where something had been dragged. Scuff marks from shoes. Some were fresh enough to break the thin film of dust completely. He crouched to inspect them, shining the flashlight closer. Yes, someone had been here recently. Artem swallowed hard, trying to convince himself that perhaps an inspector or a group of squatters had passed through. Anything was better than the darker possibilities whispering at the edges of his thoughts. He forced himself onward. The first door he came to had a rusted number plate screwed unevenly into the metal. The number was partially corroded, as though something had once been violently scraped across it. He tried the handle. It resisted but eventually gave way with a loud, grinding protest that made him wince. When the door cracked open, a rush of colder air seeped out, and the sight within made Artem's breath catch in his chest. The small room beyond was unmistakably arranged like a patient ward. A single steel bed sat bolted to the floor, straps still hanging from its sides, buckles rusted but intact. An IV pole leaned crookedly in the corner, a brittle tube dangling like a dead vine. Cabinets with glass fronts were clouded with condensation from the damp chill, revealing murky shadows of medical supplies inside. Artem didn't step inside. He didn't have to. The intent of this space was already clear. This was no lighthouse. It was a facility for confinement. Perhaps medical, perhaps something worse. He backed away and closed the door just as slowly as he had opened it, careful not to let it slam. He moved farther along the corridor, sweeping his light across the walls. More doorways, more metallic numbers. In the glow of the flashlight, he caught sight of dark smears along the paint. Long ago dried, but still recognizable. His chest tightened. He didn't want to think about how those stains had gotten there. He tried another door and found it stuck, but his forceful push brought it open just enough for him to peek in. What he saw this time was worse. The body on the bed had been there a long time, skin and flesh, reduced to stiff remnants beneath ragged clothes, bones bound by faded straps. The empty sockets of the skull stared upward, as though still waiting for help that never came. Artem stumbled back, nearly falling as he shut the door with trembling hands. His flashlight wobbled, casting wild, dancing shadows across the corridor. He leaned into the wall, closing his eyes for a moment while trying to get control of his breath. The silence around him felt oppressive, as if the walls absorbed every gasp of air, every shaken exhale. The storm might have driven him here, but something else had kept these people inside. Something intentional. He needed answers. He needed a reason for why a place like this existed on a forgotten patch of rock. The next section of the corridor split into two directions upward, toward the heart of the lighthouse, or deeper into the unknown below. The upward path felt safer. Higher ground, light, possibility of communication equipment. If anyone had once lived here to keep the faint beacon running, they would have stayed closer to the top. His boots clanged against the metal steps of a staircase, winding up through the center of the tower. Each step echoed hollowly, the sound resounding as though calling out to an audience he couldn't see. His flashlight skimmed across walls marked by peeling paint and rust that spread like infections along the rails and corners. Halfway up, he noticed the first hints of what had once been attempts to humanize the space posters hanging unevenly, corners curled and frayed. Medical charts, instructions. the remnants of a place that once tried to pretend it was legitimate. The next level opened to a row of small offices, or what had been turned into offices. Tables crowded with yellowed medical files, shattered devices, and dusty clipboards. Papers littered the ground, brittle and curling with age. Artem knelt, lifting one of the scattered documents. It crackled under his fingertips. The text was faded, but still readable. Patient numbers, symptoms, dates. The words suspected infection repeated over and over like a mantra. The instructions were as cold as stone. Isolate, restrain, observe. Every line felt wrong. The fear in the margins of the papers wasn't openly written, but Artem could feel it, an unspoken truth hovering between the sentences, concealed by clinical language and bureaucracy. He turned toward a metal cabinet kicked partially open. Inside were more files, stacked haphazardly as though someone had rifled through them in haste. He pulled out a thick medical folder, its cover stamped with a large number. Inside there were charts, test results, handwritten notes. One page caught his attention. The medical conclusions stated that no infection had been detected. The patient had been healthy, yet the chart noted, "Remain in isolation." Artem felt the air tighten in his lungs. He flipped through more pages. Case after case. Negative test results. Still locked away. Still restrained. Still forgotten. It dawned on him then that whatever had happened here was not an overreaction to a real threat. It was a mistake, a secret, a horror that those in power decided was easier to bury alive than admit to the world. He backed away from the open cabinet, his mind racing. How many? How long? How many families were told a lie about a sickness that didn't exist? The storm might have driven him into this nightmare, but something far crueler had imprisoned those who came before him. He forced himself to move onward, deeper into the level. Everywhere he looked, he found evidence of desperation masquerading as procedure. Clipboards with incomplete notes, abandoned personal effects, a shoe lying alone under a desk, too small to belong to a grown adult, a bracelet made of thread and beads left on a dusty shelf. He came upon a room larger than the others, what must have been the main ward. Beds stood in rows, each one with thick straps dangling like lifeless snakes. Some beds held shapes under worn blankets, slumped remains curled in on themselves, time having reduced them to brittle husks. Artem felt nausea rise, forcing him to look away as he fought against the urge to flee. But fleeing wouldn't help him leave this island. That metal door back at the entrance was now a boundary between him and the world he once recognized. He turned toward the staircase leading to the uppermost level, where he knew the lantern room had to be. The faint light he had seen from the sea must have been coming from somewhere. Perhaps there was still power, still a working radio. Maybe he could call for help and report what he'd found. As he climbed the last section of the stairs, he paused again to steady his breathing. Panic was creeping up his throat like rising water. His flashlight beam shook while he remembered the image of those bound skeletons. How had this place been allowed to exist? Why had no one come? He reached a sturdy door with reinforced glass panels, leading into what seemed to be a control area. The room beyond had a different feel, still grim, but less decayed. Equipment lined the walls, powered by a generator that hummed slowly, giving life to the flickering beacon above. The light swayed over large consoles where radios, old surveillance monitors, and communication tools lay dormant in low-power mode. Someone had kept the system alive just enough for the outside world to think the lighthouse stood as a simple, maritime relic. He stepped inside, scanning the consoles. The radio looked operational. He reached for the receiver with hopeful fingertips, but hesitation held him. If this station was still in use, if someone still came here, then calling for help might alert the worst kind of attention. Instead of rescue, he might summon the same people who allowed these horrors to unfold. Artem lowered the radio handset slowly. For now, he needed to understand the full truth before sending any signal. A sudden noise pulled his focus sharply, a light scrape, as if something shifted below him. His heart thudded painfully. He strained to listen. Nothing followed. Silence flooded in again, smothering the moment. He forced himself to keep moving, to examine every corner. He tried the door to the lantern room. It opened easily, surprising him. The light mechanism inside was old but functional. Someone had rewired the system to connect to the generator, but only just enough to provide a minimal beam, almost as if they didn't want the lighthouse to be seen too clearly. He stepped back, his breath growing shallow. The storm still raged outside, but the true danger was no longer in the wind or waves. Every detail of the tower whispered the same message. This was a prison disguised as a guardian, a place built not to save sailors, but to hide victims. He descended the stairs again, afraid to stay too long in the vulnerable open spaces. His footsteps seemed louder than before. He couldn't shake the feeling of eyes following him in the dark, of a presence just behind his shoulder. At the landing, he paused in front of another door. Deep gouges marred the surface. Long, violent scars dug into the metal. Beneath them, rust had bloomed like dried blood. Something or someone had tried desperately to get out. He could almost hear the nails tearing, the pleading cries trapped forever behind layers of cold steel. His mind begged him to leave, to run back to the boat and pray that he might find a way to coax the engine back to life. But the truth was unavoidable. The boat was ruined, the sea unforgiving, and this lighthouse held all the answers, whether he wanted them or not. He swallowed hard and turned toward the next door. If he was to understand what had happened here, he needed to keep looking. The deeper he ventured, the more he realized that every shadow was a grave marker, every silence a confession. The lighthouse had not guided him to safety. It had lured him into a secret the world had hoped would stay drowned in the dark. The dim glow from the generator-powered light cast long, uncertain shadows through the narrow halls as Artem descended from the lantern level. The storm continued to batter the tower with relentless force. Yet inside the lighthouse, the silence felt even more oppressive than the roar of the sea. Every step he took echoed faintly in the emptiness, the metal beneath his boots groaning as though resenting his intrusion. He tried to steady his breathing, but the images from the ward below kept forcing themselves into his thoughts. The bound skeletons, the straps stained with time, and the cold clinical notes written as though the people strapped into those beds had been nothing more than failed experiments. He needed answers, facts to make sense of what his senses already knew. The offices he had found earlier were the only place that looked capable of holding such truths. So he turned toward the level where the medical files lay strewn across the floor like discarded confessions. His flashlight, trembling in his grasp, illuminated the disorder with uncomfortable clarity. The desks, once arranged in neat rows, had been shoved around, drawers yanked out, papers cascading in chaotic heaps. It looked less like a simple evacuation and more like a frantic attempt to destroy evidence before someone else could see it. Yet not everything had been taken. Enough remained to expose something terrible enough to keep buried. Artem approached a desk pushed partly against the wall. He hesitated for a moment, the weight of dread slowing his hands. But curiosity and the stubborn need to understand outweighed the fear festering inside him. He sifted through the paperwork, brushing aside dust. One document after another told the same story. Patients arrived here with the claim of carrying a dangerous, highly contagious illness, the kind that made officials quick to overreact, terrified of headlines and public outcry. But nearly every test result showed the same conclusion: negative. He flipped through test results with increasing urgency. The patterns were unmistakable. Some entries included brief descriptions: a man with a persistent cough, a woman who had fainted in a crowded market, a teenager running a fever after returning from travel. Everyday illnesses misdiagnosed in a climate of panic. But once sent here, these people never left. His chest tightened as he considered the unimaginable horror of being locked away. Healthy, still believing a doctor might come, tell you it was safe to go home. Artem's flashlight reflected off the cracked glass of a framed certificate on the wall. It had belonged to a doctor named Emile Duren, the head of medical operations on the island. A photograph at the corner of the certificate showed a middle-aged man in a white coat, smiling proudly as though he had once believed in healing. Artem wondered what had become of that man. Did he leave? Had he been taken away as well? Or had he met his end here, buried beneath the silence, forgotten just like his patients? Pulling open a drawer, Artem uncovered a book thicker than any of the folders. Its leather cover was cracked and warped by damp. A small brass clasp had rusted shut, but with a firm tug it broke loose. The first pages revealed careful handwriting, more personal than the detached medical notes he had been reading. This wasn't official documentation. This was a diary. He angled his flashlight carefully so the beam illuminated the ink without blinding him. The entries began with a tone of formality, as though the writer expected others to read and approve them, but the voice shifted gradually into something raw and fearful. At first, the diary described uncertainty, the arrival of the first patients whose symptoms didn't match anything recognizable. The facility was supposed to be a temporary quarantine site, a precautionary measure until the situation could be assessed. But soon the entries described confusion and doubt. Diagnostic tests contradicted the initial claims of infection. Patients showed no progression of disease. Some recovered fully within days, yet they were never released. The author wrote of requesting clarification, pleading for guidance only to receive orders to maintain containment indefinitely. Words like liability, public unrest, and uncontrolled rumor spread appeared frequently in the justifications. The diary entries took a darker turn as supplies became scarce. The doctor's handwriting grew erratic, letters cramped and hurried. He described long nights spent calming, terrified patients who begged for explanations. He recorded the first deaths not from any illness, but from dehydration and neglect. Bodies removed under the cover of night. Staff who disappeared after questioning the orders. Finally, the last entries seemed to teeter on the edge of madness. Apologies scrawled across the margins. Repeated pleas for forgiveness from people who could no longer grant it. Artem's fingers tightened on the pages as he read the final note, written with such force the pen had almost torn through the paper. We were abandoned. They left us with the infected, but there was no infection. We were the disease they wanted to cure from the world. He closed the diary slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The truth was clearer than ever, and far more horrifying than he had imagined. This lighthouse had been a secret burial ground for a political mistake. Society's errors had been hidden here, sacrificed to avoid accountability. The people who died in the beds below had been victims not of sickness, but of fear. He set the diary aside and pulled himself to his feet, needing to move, needing to breathe air not saturated with ancient secrets. His flashlight passed across another set of documents, papers stamped urgently with orders to cease further communication. He skimmed through them, barely believing his own eyes. The isolation was intentional, official, approved, even celebrated as a protective measure. He paced backward, away from the desk, his heart pounding as he tried to compose himself. The foundation of his reality, his belief that authorities at least tried to do what was right, crumbled beneath this mountain of proof that they had knowingly condemned the innocent. He turned toward the hallway, wanting distance between himself and the pages of horror. But as he moved, his light caught on something etched onto the wall beside the doorframe. He stepped closer, wiping dust away with the back of his sleeve. Words scratched into the surface with something sharp. They were uneven and frantic. Don't trust the men in masks. Beneath that, they won't let you leave. The warning struck him like a punch. His muscles tensed instinctively, and he felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the cold air. Suddenly, every sound seemed amplified. His own breathing sounded too loud, the hum of the generator too close. A faint creak somewhere above made his skin prickle. He was no longer alone. Someone or something still remained here. Perhaps they had never left. Perhaps they had waited, surviving in the shadows while the outside world forgot them. A new realization hit him like a falling weight. That flickering beacon he had seen from the sea was likely never meant to save him. It was a decoy designed to keep the lie alive, to make the lighthouse appear as nothing but a forgotten relic. Anyone who investigated the island risked becoming part of its secret. Artem forced himself to continue exploring, despite the way his bones felt weighted with dread. He returned to the central hall and noticed another room he hadn't inspected. The door hung crookedly, its frame splintered from a forceful blow. Had someone tried to break into it or out? He nudged it open with his flashlight and froze. Inside, more beds filled the small ward. Most were empty except for cracked cushions and disfigured pillows. But 2 beds still held the skeletons of their former prisoners. Their limbs were twisted unnaturally, straps cutting into the bone where the flesh had once been. One of the skulls tilted in his direction, as though turning to look at him with eternal accusation. Artem felt bile rise in his throat and tore his gaze away. He left the room quickly, closing the door on what little dignity those victims had left. But the view continued to haunt him, sitting heavily in his chest. He couldn't erase it. Instead, he pressed forward, deeper into the facility, where the mustiness intensified and the shadows grew thicker. The next room he entered surprised him. Lining the walls were shelves filled with personal items, photographs, rings stripped from fingers, small handmade crafts, even children's toys dulled with dust. He reached out automatically, but then hesitated. The thought of touching the belongings of those who never returned home felt wrong, like an intrusion into memories not meant for strangers. Instead, he studied the objects from a respectful distance. These things were testimonies, each one a voice stolen from the world, once held in living hands, now stored like evidence that would never reach a courtroom. He stepped back into the hallway, feeling as though the walls had begun to close in around him. His mind struggled to grasp the layers of tragedy within these confines. Every room exposed another wound, every file another name that had been erased. This place wasn't merely forgotten, it had been buried intentionally. Artem's flashlight flickered for a moment, and he slapped it against his palm until the beam steadied. The sudden thought of it dying left him cold. Without light, the tower would consume him as it had consumed the others. Moving carefully, he returned to the stairwell. The silence pressed hard against his ears, amplifying even the faintest noise. His imagination began filling the void with thoughts of footsteps behind him, whispers lost in the walls, and eyes watching from doorways just beyond the reach of light. He climbed slowly, each step heavier than the last. He had come here to escape a storm, but what he discovered instead was a dark truth that had slept beneath the world's notice for years. His presence had disturbed that sleep, and something in the air told him that the lighthouse did not want its secret awakened. As he reached the landing and stepped into the corridor leading back toward the upper rooms, he paused again. The floor squeaked under his weight, and he froze. It wasn't his step that had made the noise. Someone was nearby. The silence was no longer empty. It was hiding something or someone waiting. Artem held his breath, heart pounding against his ribs. The storm outside crashed on, thunder and wind swirling like a warning. But he knew now that the true threat was not the sea. It was what the sea had guided him toward. The lighthouse, the prison, the mass grave. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and forced himself to keep moving, though every instinct begged him to run. What lay ahead would only deepen the nightmare he had stumbled into. But he couldn't turn back. Not now. The truth demanded witness, and the truth in this place was only just beginning to reveal itself. Artem stood completely still. The beam of his flashlight pointed toward the darkness ahead. The air felt different now, alive with something unseen. It wasn't just the dread clinging to him anymore. It was presence. A certainty settled deep in his gut. He was not the only living soul left in this rotten monument to forgotten victims. The silence was no longer merely the absence of sound. It was a mask over breathing, footsteps, movement, someone watching. His pulse hammered in his ears as he listened. The storm outside raged on, wind slamming into the walls and ricocheting through the structure with deep metallic groans. For a moment, he tried to convince himself that the strange noises were merely the tower protesting the weather. But the rhythm was wrong. Storms didn't imitate footsteps. He moved slowly down the corridor, forcing each silent step. His flashlight scanned over the peeling walls and broken fixtures, throwing distorted figures in the shadows that dissolved the instant he tried to focus on them. The hair on the back of his neck rose as the feeling of being followed intensified. He wanted to turn around and shine the light behind him, but fear held his neck stiff. He feared what he might see more than what might be lurking out of sight. The corridor stretched deeper into the island facility, and the smell of age and decay grew stronger. Rust mixed with something coppery and foul in odor he had first noticed only faintly upon entering. Now it felt thicker, clinging to his throat with every breath. The heavy door with the gouged marks came into view again, and Artem paused, studying the jagged scars carved into the metal. They weren't random. They were deliberate, desperate. Score marks where fingers or tools had violently scraped against the door in hopes of escape. There was fear etched into those cuts, a story of someone trapped, someone fighting to live even when every authority had given up on them. He forced himself to move past the door, though the weight of all those unanswered questions pressed against his chest. Further down the hallway, he discovered the source of the recent disturbances. Small items displaced, footprints partially over the dust, a blanket shabbily arranged in a corner where someone had been sleeping not too long ago. An empty tin can lay nearby, lid sharply removed for access. It wasn't ancient. This was recent. His throat tightened when he saw the first clear footprint, slightly smudged but undeniably fresh. He crouched, examining it under the unsteady light. Not a big boot, a standard-sized shoe, likely belonging to a man, perhaps someone from the staff long ago, or one of the patients who had survived against all odds. The idea sent chills through him. To still be alive in this place, after years of abandonment and death, meant the survivor had lived in darkness, surrounded by reminders of his own doom. What had he eaten? How had he endured the silence of the dead, the echoes of suffering? Survivors of horror rarely remained whole. Artem stood slowly, scanning the corridor again. He imagined someone gaunt and hollow-faced, their sanity frayed thin after years alone. That person might not welcome a stranger now occupying their domain. He suddenly felt like prey trespassing in a predator's lair. A sound soft but unmistakable cut through the air. A quick shuffle of foot against concrete, abrupt and close. Artem whipped around, shining the light in the direction of the noise. Nothing moved, but he knew someone had just slipped out of sight. His heart pounded faster, each beat pushing another surge of adrenaline through him. He steadied the light on the floor and followed the source of the sound to a heavy door slightly ajar. Unlike the others, this one bore a reinforced lock that appeared newer, more intentional, sturdier, as if it were meant to contain something specific. Rust hadn't fully taken it yet. Scratches again scarred the surface, but these were fresher than the others. Artem hesitated. He could hear something behind the door. Breathing faint, rasping, uneven. Human breathing. Fear surged violently through him, but another feeling rose alongside it. Far more stubborn. The refusal to abandon someone as those who built this place had once done. He braced his shoulder against the cold metal and pushed. The door groaned, but did not give. He tried again, harder. His muscles strained, teeth clenched as the door inched forward. The lock resisted him, but rust and time had weakened its grip. A final shove forced the metal bolt to snap with a sharp crack that echoed through the corridors like a gunshot. The door swung open abruptly, and Artem stumbled forward into the darkness beyond. His flashlight found a small chamber more cell than room. The walls were stained with years of damp and neglect. A crude bed, fashioned from scavenged scraps and wrapped in ragged blankets, lay in the corner. And on it, curled like a wounded animal, was a man. The figure flinched violently at the sudden intrusion. He shielded his face from the light with a thin arm, bones visible beneath parchment-like skin. Clothes hung off him in tatters, a grotesque mix of hospital fabric stitched clumsily with shredded bedding. His hair fell in matted strands over a face sunken and pale, eyes burning wildly with a mix of fear and disbelief. Artem lowered the light slightly, careful not to blind him. The man's breath trembled in his chest, each inhale a struggle, each exhale a short gasp, as though his lungs remembered only pain. "I'm not here to hurt you," Artem said quietly, his voice strained but calm. The words felt strange in the silence, too normal for a place where normal no longer existed. The man didn't respond, his gaze fixed on Artem with mistrust so raw it felt like a knife edge. Slowly, cautiously, Artem stepped farther into the room, scanning for any threat. The man's corner was littered with small remnants of food containers, rusted tins, broken glass jars, scraps torn from packaging. Someone had been bringing supplies, or dumping them. The survivor had not lived here alone without assistance. Someone had wanted him alive for a time. Artem knelt at a safe distance, speaking in a low, steady tone. He introduced himself, trying to build some fragile thread of trust. The man's wild eyes darted around the room, then back to Artem. At last, the tension in his posture shifted. Not relaxed, but less panicked. He spoke, voice crackling like paper tearing. A single whisper at first, then a forming sentence. Artem leaned closer, straining to hear. The man told him he was a medical assistant, had been once, years ago, when the island had operated under the guise of emergency health containment. He had remained when others fled or were evacuated with silent promises to return. But the promises dissolved. The supply runs grew scarce, then stopped entirely. The staff trapped with him vanished one by one. Some fled. Others simply died. The man had survived because he refused to give up breath as easily as everyone expected. He ate whatever was left. He found ways to siphon water from rusted pipes. In the flickering glow of the generator that rarely died completely, he stayed alive while the rest of the world forgot this place existed. He remained because no one came for him. He remained because they had locked him in and thrown away the key. The shame in his broken voice told Artem that he once tried to help those trapped here. He had fought to keep patients alive until they turned into bodies he could no longer carry. Fear and grief had eventually sealed him into a solitary nightmare. When he finished his reluctant account, he stared at Artem with suspicion again. Narrow eyes filled with the terror of someone who had been hunted by silence for too long. He warned Artem that the lighthouse wasn't entirely abandoned. There were still visitors men who arrived on sleek, dark boats late at night and walked the halls with purpose. He described the figures with hushed dread, men who checked the archives, destroyed files, and made sure that any evidence still remaining would never reach daylight. They wore no uniforms. Their faces were always hidden, and they always came only after the storm tides drowned any chance of another vessel approaching. They did not want the story of this place spreading. Not now. Not ever. Artem listened, a heavy weight settling against his ribs with every word. He felt the trembling in the man's voice, fear so deeply ingrained it had become instinct. And then he understood the unfinished noise he'd heard earlier. The survivor had been trying to move quietly, hiding from both the living and the dead. A sudden memory flashed across Artem's mind, that flickering light at the top of the tower. It hadn't been a beacon. It had been a signal. A lie designed to reassure the authorities that their secret was still safely rotting away beneath rusted steel and rock. "How long since they last came?" Artem asked. The man's expression twisted, uncertain. Days blurred into one another when every dawn was identical. But he believed it had not been long. The food scraps matched newer packaging. The rusted lock had been replaced not too long ago. Men in shadow still cared enough to ensure this island never spoke again. A chill crawled up Artem's spine. He stood and moved toward the door, his flashlight sweeping the corridor once more. The survivor remained in the corner, watching him with widened eyes as though he could predict something terrible approaching. And then Artem heard it, a deep thud, the muffled splash of something heavy cutting through waves, the mechanical hum of an engine fighting the stormy sea. Then another sound, boots clattering against a rocky landing. Footsteps. They were no longer alone. The executioners had come back to check their mistakes. Artem turned to the man, the coil of fear tightening, constricting him in place. The survivor's voice trembled with one final warning, each syllable shivering through the air. "They don't let anyone leave." The hallway lights flickered under the struggling power of the generator as thunder cracked above them. Artem's grip tightened around the flashlight, his heartbeat thundering in sync with the storm. He no longer questioned whether the man was telling the truth. He knew the danger had arrived, and he knew the lighthouse would demand a price from anyone who tried to escape with its secrets. The footsteps outside echoed like a countdown. The sound of the approaching footsteps might as well have been thunder inside Artem's skull. Each step was heavy, purposeful, and far too real to dismiss as the noise of an old building shifting under the storm's assault. The medical assistant, this gaunt remnant of a man, pressed himself against the far wall of his cramped cell, his eyes wide with the raw terror of a hunted animal. Artem felt the same dread rising within him, though he fought to keep it from paralyzing him completely. He leaned closer to the man, trying to keep his voice low and steady. "Who are they?" Artem asked, though he already knew the answer. They were the people responsible for every terrible discovery he had made in this place. The ones who had left these patients to die in silence, without justice, without acknowledgement. The ones who still returned, long after the island had lost its purpose, to make sure the dead stayed dead and the truth stayed buried. The survivor's voice cracked like dry leaves when he answered. They're not doctors, not anymore. They're the cleanup. They keep the secret from escaping. He shivered violently, a reflex born of countless nights spent listening to the same footsteps echo through the halls. They come to make sure no one tells the world what happened here. Artem's pulse hammered hard enough that he feared the strangers would hear it, even through the walls. He knew he had no weapon, no plan, nothing but a flashlight and the knowledge he had stumbled upon, a knowledge these men clearly didn't want anyone carrying out of this tower. If they found him, the ending would be swift and quiet. He couldn't stay here. He reached down and helped the man to his feet. At first, the survivor resisted, limbs trembling and weak. But then he gripped Artem's arm with surprising strength for a body that looked so fragile, as though the last reserves of his will had flared to life. Artem felt bones beneath skin as delicate as paper. Yet beneath all that frailty was a pulse of determination that had refused to die even when everything else had. "We can't stay," Artem murmured. "If they close in, we'll be cornered." The man nodded shakily, barely able to stand without Artem's support. With one arm wrapped around Artem's shoulders, they slowly made their way into the corridor. The floor here was slick with moisture that seeped through the old concrete, and every step had to be calculated so their boots would not betray them with a misplaced sound. The footsteps above them had multiplied, now accompanied by quiet voices muffled but commanding. Men used to giving orders, men who did not panic or hesitate. Artem's flashlight felt suddenly like a liability, a flare in the dark that would give away their position. He switched it off, leaving them with only the faint glow of emergency lights flickering weakly from the generator's output. Without warning, the corridor became a blur of shadows and flickers, walls seeming to breathe as the light pulsed, on and off, like a heartbeat. Artem guided the survivor deeper into the facility, trying to avoid known dead ends. He remembered seeing a set of maintenance stairs somewhere farther down. If they could reach them, perhaps they could slip beneath the tower into storage rooms, and from there, maybe find a way outside that bypassed the intruders. As they moved, the survivor's legs buckled several times, forcing Artem to pause and let him regain balance. The man's breathing was ragged, each gasp louder than the last. He was clearly struggling to adjust to movement after so much confinement. Artem gritted his teeth, realizing the danger in every noise they made. They had to be silent, absolutely silent, if they hoped to survive the next hour. Above them, another door slammed, then another. The voices moved closer, footsteps descending the metal stairs. Artem could almost hear the scrape of weapons against gear belts, the cold readiness of those whose job demanded violence. The survivor tugged on Artem's sleeve, pointing with a trembling hand toward a narrow corridor Artem hadn't noticed earlier. It was partially obstructed by a toppled medical cabinet and scattered debris, as though deliberately concealed or neglected long ago. With no better option, Artem helped the man squeeze through the gap, their shoulders scraping painfully against jagged metal. On the other side, darkness swallowed them whole. The air was denser here, untouched by the faint light from the generator. Artem turned the flashlight on for a brief moment, sweeping it downward. His heart lurched, stairs leading even further below. He wasn't sure whether to feel hope or dread. "This goes to the old storerooms," the survivor whispered, "and the generator." His voice carried the memory of countless journeys through these halls, when he still had strength enough to walk alone. Artem supported his weight as they descended. The steps creaked loudly under them, and for each groan of metal, Artem's breath hitched. He prayed the sounds wouldn't carry upward to alert the intruders. The temperature dropped further as they reached the lower level. It was almost enough to steal the air from his lungs. Dampness clung to his skin, and he could hear the low hum of machinery through the concrete, a lifeline still beating weakly in an organism long since declared dead. This sublevel was larger than he expected. Rows of rusted lockers lined one wall, while crates filled the center of the room like forgotten tombs. The survivor pointed weakly to a small storage closet. "We can hide there," he breathed, "until they leave." Artem shook his head. Hiding meant waiting to be found. Waiting meant death. "We can't just wait. They'll search everywhere." The survivor's eyes, pale and sunken, filled with a flicker of panic. "Then what? We can't escape without the boat." Artem's jaw tightened. The intruders wouldn't sail here without transportation. If they came by boat, then the boat could be their salvation, if they could reach it. The thought came with equal parts adrenaline and fear. Sneaking past trained men in a structure designed for containment sounded like a madman's plan. But the survivor's life, in his own, meant the attempt was necessary. And beyond that, beyond survival, there were the documents. The truths locked in this mausoleum of bureaucratic cruelty. Truths the world deserved to know. Artem crouched and set the flashlight beside them, letting its dim beam illuminate just enough of their makeshift shelter. He lowered his voice to a whisper, nearly lost under the hum of machinery. "We need to gather the records, the diary, the files proving what they did here." His throat tightened with urgency. "If we escape empty-handed, then this place remains buried. Everyone here dies twice." The survivor held Artem's gaze for a long moment. In the silence between them lay years of torment, years of pleading with the walls for someone alive to remember those who perished. The man's voice shook when he finally answered. "I'll show you where the most important ones are kept." Artem helped him stand again, though he nearly collapsed from exhaustion. Step by step, they made their way down a side corridor Artem had barely noticed earlier. A hallway with sealed doors that looked stronger than anything above. At the end, they approached a reinforced archive room, its door slightly ajar. Artem felt a flicker of gratitude toward the chaos that had spilled through these halls after abandonment. The intruders who visited to destroy evidence must have left this one in haste last time. Half open, files inside still intact. They slipped into the archive and Artem's stomach twisted at the sight of floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled with heavy binders and crates. There was no time to gather everything. The survivor guided him toward a central shelf where a locked metal case rested. "That contains the full list of patients," he whispered. "Names, diagnoses, test results, everything they tried to erase." The survivor pointed to another binder lying near the bottom. "And that holds the orders, the signatures." Artem didn't need further explanation. Those documents carried the weight of justice. He found a canvas bag amid the clutter and stuffed the most critical files inside, his fingers moving faster than he thought possible, despite the weight pressing against his lungs. As he worked, the survivor leaned against a shelf, panting heavily. His frail frame was trembling uncontrollably, his strength rapidly fading. Artem glanced at him anxiously, worried he might collapse before they reached the surface again. But when their eyes met, he saw something fierce and unbroken in that haunted stare. "Don't stop now," the survivor rasped. "Get it all. Make sure what happened here isn't forgotten." Above them, the slam of a door made both of them freeze. The heavy footfalls echoing through the levels were no longer distant. They were descending, searching, closing in. Artem zipped the bag shut and slung it over his shoulder, nearly losing his balance when the weight pulled him sideways. The survivor struggled to straighten himself. They had no time to spare. "Can you walk?" Artem asked, his voice raw. The survivor nodded, though barely. "As far as I must." Artem helped him stand once more, gripping him firmly under the arm. They moved back toward the staircase, each second feeling like a stolen breath. The intruders' flashlights began to flicker through the cracks in the floorboards above. Shadows moved with predatory patience. Artem and the survivor reached the stairs and paused. The storm outside wailed like a warning. Above them lay danger and confrontation. Below them, no escape. The survivor touched Artem's arm, his voice cracking with urgency. "Whatever happens, you must get those documents out." Artem swallowed, the weight of that responsibility pressing like iron on his shoulders. "We'll go together," he insisted, though his heart whispered doubts he refused to voice. The survivor's expression softened with something like gratitude and something like resignation. The first intruder's boot struck the metal stair above, sending a loud, ringing note spiraling downward through the corridors. The time for secrecy was over. Artem tightened his grip on the man beside him, took a breath that tasted like rust and fear, and prepared to face the storm within the tower, worse than any the ocean had ever brought to shore, because now the living hunted them. The intruders were close, too close for hesitation. The metal staircase vibrated under the rhythmic force of their boots, the sound rising and falling like a grim mechanical heartbeat. Artem pulled the weakened medical assistant along, one hand clamped around the strap of the heavy canvas bag containing the files. Each step forward felt like stepping deeper into a nightmare that refused to wake. They reached the junction where the stairwell branched. Upward led to the generator floor and the access to the outside world. Downward descended into a place Artem refused to explore, a place that had already consumed enough lives. He guided the survivor upward, trying to steady him with whispered encouragement. The survivor's breath rattled in his chest, every movement a struggle against the years of captivity that had drained him of strength. But his resolve remained raw and fierce in his eyes, pushing him onward. The lights flickered once, dimming to almost nothing before flaring again. The generator was failing, strained by the violent storm battering the island. Artem's flashlight had become their lifeline, but he couldn't risk turning it on. Any flicker of movement or light would draw the attention of the men searching for them. They climbed slowly, painfully, limbs burning with the demand for silence. Voices rang below, short commands, clipped and focused. These men were trained. Their tone held no uncertainty. They believed they were cleaning up the remnants of something that should have never been found. A gunshot cracked through the halls. Artem flinched, his heart slamming hard enough to knock the air from his lungs. The bullet had struck a wall somewhere below, the ricochet screaming against steel. The intruders had found signs of their presence. There was no more doubt. They were hunting. Artem tightened his grip on the survivor, momentum shifting from cautious retreat to desperate escape. He climbed faster, but still careful to keep from slipping or making noise. The stairwell twisted upward in tight spirals, the structure groaning under the pressure of the storm's rage. Wind whistled through distant cracks, bringing with it a cold spray of seawater that tasted of iron on Artem's tongue. They emerged into the generator room again, the hum louder here, a muted roar of machinery that hid their footsteps for a few precious seconds. Artem paused to gather himself, trying to envision the route from here. The main entrance door was heavy, but it was their way to the outside. The sea might still be raging beyond those walls, but the boat the intruders arrived in represented a chance, slim but real. He guided the survivor toward the corridor leading to the exit. Just as they reached it, another metallic slam echoed behind them, the sound of the intruders breaching the level below. Flashlight beams bounced up through the stairwell. Shadows lurched like predators climbing out of graves. Artem cursed silently under his breath and continued forward, half carrying the frail man whose knees buckled with every second step. The weight of the bag dug painfully into his shoulder, the documents inside shifting like sandbags. He refused to drop them. They were worth more than his life. They reached the door. Artem pressed his shoulder against it, pushing with all his strength. The hinges groaned loudly, scraping against rusted metal. The noise stabbed through the silence like a flare. Voices behind them grew louder in response. Artem shoved harder, and the door gave way at last, bursting outward into the howling storm. The air outside hit him like a slap, cold, wet, violent. Rain slashed across his face, and the wind roared through his clothes, prying at him as though trying to drag him back inside. The survivor gasped sharply, recoiling from the onslaught of open air he had not felt in years. The coastline lay a short distance ahead, shrouded in darkness and storm spray. Artem adjusted his grip on the canvas bag and pushed forward with the desperation of a cornered animal. The rocks beneath their feet were slick, forcing them to move carefully despite the urgency. The sound of the intruders poured through the open door behind them, boots pounding metal with speed now, not caution. They had been spotted. A shouted order cut through the storm. "Stop! Don't move!" Artem ignored it, tightening his jaw. The survivor leaned heavily against him, using whatever strength remained just to keep upright. They scrambled across the uneven terrain toward the shape of the boat, barely visible through the curtain of rain-sleek, modern, the kind used by men who needed speed and silence. A shot cracked through the air. Stone fragments exploded near Artem's feet. He staggered, pulling the survivor down behind a jagged rock. His ears rang with the force of the blast, the proximity shaking him to the bone. He resisted the urge to look back, knowing that multiple guns were now trained toward him and the bag he carried. He clutched it tighter. The survivor panted, gasping, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Don't let them take it back." His eyes, hollowed by years of torment, held something raw and pleading. "Promise me." Artem nodded, throat too tight to speak. Another bullet screamed overhead, splashing into the sea. He peered around the rock, searching for any possible route that would shield them from direct fire. The boat's stern was angled away from shore. If they could reach the side unseen, they might be able to board and break the lines before the intruders closed in. He helped the survivor to his feet once more, and together they made a final push toward the boat. Mud and seawater splashed under their boots, sucking at their soles. Artem slipped once, nearly falling to his knee, but recovered instantly, adrenaline burning in every muscle. A figure emerged from the lighthouse doorway behind them, dark-clad, masked, weapon drawn. The intruder advanced with level precision, unhurried and certain that escape was impossible. Weighing their odds, Artem felt a sinking realization. They would not make it both together. The survivor seemed to feel the same truth. He stopped suddenly, pulling himself free from Artem's hold. The wind whipped through his torn clothing, exposing bruised skin and bones sharp enough to cut through the storm. His voice carried strangely clear, unburdened by the fear that had defined him for so long. "Go," he said. Artem shook his head instantly, refusing to accept it. But the survivor's expression turned resolute, firm with a strength that had survived every cruelty imaginable. "You have the proof," he insisted. "Take it to the world. Let them know what they did here. Let them know who they killed." He took a step forward, placing himself between Artem and the approaching threat. His thin arms raised not to fight, but to draw attention away, to buy Artem seconds. "I've been dead for years," he said quietly. "Don't let them erase us completely." Before Artem could protest again, the man pushed him hard toward the water's edge. Artem stumbled, nearly losing the bag, then caught himself and turned, frozen by the bravery or tragedy unfolding behind him. The survivor stood tall, shoulders squared against the storm, and for the first time since Artem had found him, there was no fear in his eyes. Gunfire erupted. The man's body jerked with the bullet's impact, but he did not fall. Not at first. He remained standing for one impossible second, face lifted toward the rain like he was finally breathing free air. Then he collapsed into the surf silent, limbs folding into shadow, swallowed by the sea he had never been allowed to reach. Artem ripped his gaze away, forcing himself not to break under the grief clawing at his chest. He sprinted the final distance to the boat, every muscle screaming. He grabbed the side rail, hauled himself over the edge, and landed heavily onto the deck just as another shot rang out. He found the ignition on instinct. His hands shook as he fumbled for the controls, the unfamiliar layout slowing him down. Shouts rose closer, fast, closing, relentless. Finally, the engine roared to life, drowning the chaos in mechanical power. Artem shoved the throttle forward. The boat lurched, tearing away from the rocks. He held tight, refusing to look back. The waves smashed against the bow, lifting and dropping the vessel violently. But Artem stayed focused, eyes fixed ahead toward the pitch-black horizon. Wind stung his face. Salt water blinded his eyes. The island shrank behind him into a dark blot swallowed by the storm. Only then did he allow himself to look down at the soaked canvas bag strapped tight against his chest. Inside that bag were names, every one of them a stolen life. Inside were signatures, proof of decisions made by those who had chosen convenience over humanity. Inside was the truth, a truth only he now carried. He tightened his grip until his knuckles whitened. The storm might kill him before he reached land. The men behind him might track him down. The world might ignore him. But for the first time, Artem felt something burn within him. Not desperation, purpose. He would not let them vanish. He would not let them win. He would not let the voices of the dead drown beneath the waves any longer. The lighthouse receded entirely, its faint false light flickering out as thunder cracked across the sky. Artem pressed forward through the storm, a lone man fleeing an island built on silence, carrying within him a story worth dying for, and even more worth surviving. Behind him, the truth waited for the world to listen, and ahead of him, the fight for justice had only just begun.